The lakefront property had always been the man's dream. It was the perfect place to escape the noise of the city, to unwind, and to enjoy the tranquility of the water. The house was cozy, nestled right next to the lake, with a large porch that overlooked the serene view. The man had spent years saving for this home, working tirelessly to make sure his family could enjoy this piece of paradise. His wife, equally excited, had already started planning their future together, imagining peaceful afternoons by the water, fishing, and watching the sunsets. For the first few weeks, everything was perfect. They woke up to the gentle sound of waves lapping against the shore, birds singing, and the soft rustling of leaves in the trees. It was the kind of place they had always dreamed of, peaceful, isolated, and beautiful. But that peace was shattered one morning when the man checked the mail. Among the usual bills and advertisements, there was a letter from the HOA. At first, he thought it was just another routine communication, but as soon as he opened it, his heart sank. The letter was formal, stating that the HOA had taken over their lakefront property for a new project. They were going to build 120 luxury cabins on the land, complete with a resort, golf course, and other amenities. The letter didn't provide much detail, but the message was clear. The man and his wife were no longer in control of their property. His mind raced as he read and reread the letter. He knew nothing about this project. The wife had not agreed to anything, and neither had he. They had always been in full control of the lakefront, and now the HOA was claiming it was theirs to develop. This wasn't just a small change, it was a complete takeover of their home. Confused and angry, the man stormed into the living room, where his wife was sitting with a cup of coffee. "You need to see this," he said, his voice tense. His wife looked up at him, startled by the urgency in his voice. She followed him to the kitchen, where he handed her the letter. As she read it, her expression shifted from surprise to disbelief. "This is ridiculous," she said, her voice sharp. "They can't just take our property like this. We've never agreed to anything." The man shook his head, feeling a wave of frustration and helplessness wash over him. "It says they've already started the process. We need to figure out what's going on." The wife stood up, her fists clenched. "We need to talk to them. We need to stop this before it goes any further." The man nodded. "I agree. But something doesn't feel right. Why would they do this without consulting us?" The wife thought for a moment. Maybe they think they can get away with it because we're new here, or maybe they've been planning this for a while. Either way, we need to make sure we're not losing our property. As they discussed their next steps, the wife began to feel a gnawing sense of unease. Something about this situation felt off. It wasn't just a land grab. It was more calculated than that. The HOA wasn't acting like they were interested in a simple development project. They seemed to be moving forward with an agenda. The wife's mind began to race, trying to make sense of the situation. They had lived here for a few weeks now, and everything seemed fine. The neighbors were friendly, and the community seemed peaceful. But now, the HOA was involved, and things were starting to unravel. The next morning, the man and his wife went to the local HOA office to demand answers. The building was small and tucked away on a quiet street. They walked in, determined to get some clarity on the situation. The receptionist greeted them with a polite smile, but her demeanor quickly shifted when she saw the expression on their faces. "How can I help you?" she asked. The man placed the letter on the desk. "We received this notice about a development project on our property," he said. "We weren't informed about any of this. We need to know what's going on." The receptionist looked at the letter and then back at them. She paused for a moment, as if weighing her response. "I'm sorry, but all the details are in the letter," she said, sounding almost too calm. "You'll need to speak with the project manager for more information." "No," the wife interjected, her frustration growing. "We need answers now. Why is our property being taken over without our consent?" The receptionist hesitated, then gestured toward a door in the back of the office. "I'll get the project manager," she said quietly. The wife and the man exchanged glances before following the receptionist to the back office. A man in his late 40s was sitting at a desk, surrounded by papers and blueprints. He looked up when they entered and offered a small, practiced smile. "Can I help you?" he asked, though there was no warmth in his tone. The wife wasted no time. "We received a letter stating that the HOA is taking over our property to build 120 cabins. We never agreed to this. Why is this happening?" The project manager adjusted his glasses and looked at the letter before speaking. "It's a part of the HOA's long-term development plan," he said, his voice flat. "We've been working on it for months. The cabins are going to improve the area, and we believe it will be beneficial for everyone in the neighborhood." The wife's frustration reached a boiling point. "How can you say that? You're taking our land without even asking us. We haven't signed anything. We haven't agreed to anything. This is our home." The project manager sighed, looking at them as if they were just another inconvenience. "It's not personal. It's about progress. The HOA owns the land around the lake, and this development is part of the community's growth. There's nothing you can do." The man and his wife stared at him in disbelief. "You don't own the land," the wife said, her voice sharp. "We do." The project manager smirked, clearly not taking them seriously. "The HOA owns the property around the lake, including the land that borders it. You were notified when you bought the house. This is just the next step." But the wife wasn't backing down. Something about this situation didn't add up, and she was determined to find out what it was. As they left the office, the wife's mind raced. "They didn't even mention the dam," she said, turning to her husband. The man looked confused. "What do you mean?" "The dam," she said, her eyes narrowing with realization. "The HOA doesn't own it. I do." The man stopped in his tracks. "What do you mean you own the dam?" The wife smiled, a knowing look crossing her face. "I've always had control over it. I've never mentioned it, but it's mine, and they have no idea." The wife's words hung in the air as they walked back to the car. This was just the beginning, and they were about to turn the tables. The HOA had underestimated them, and now, they would find out just how powerful the wife's control over the dam really was. She was ready to fight back. And this time, they wouldn't be caught off guard. This expanded part 1. The unexpected takeover keeps the tension high while revealing the first twist, the wife's control over the dam. This sets up the unfolding conflict with the HOA and builds intrigue for the audience. The wife's mind was racing as they left the HOA office. She had been in meetings with local authorities before, but this situation was different, more personal, more urgent. Her sister's warning echoed in her mind. The HOA won't give up easily. But what could they do? The wife and her husband needed answers. And now that she knew she controlled the dam, she wasn't going to let the HOA bulldoze them without a fight. Her husband, still processing the revelation about the dam, turned to her as they climbed into the car. "You really control the dam? All this time, you've never mentioned it." "I didn't think it was important," she replied, her fingers tapping nervously on the steering wheel. "But now it is. We need to use it to our advantage." Her husband stared out the window, still trying to wrap his head around everything. "But what's the real plan? They're not going to just roll over." The wife nodded. "No, they won't. But they don't realize that this entire area runs on that dam. Without it, their whole development plan could be in jeopardy." She paused, feeling the weight of what was at stake. "They've underestimated us. And it's time we show them how much they've overlooked." Over the next few days, the wife worked tirelessly, pulling up old land deeds and contracts, trying to find any loopholes she could use against the HOA. As the weekend approached, she decided to take a direct approach. The HOA had made their move, and now it was time for her to counter it. She arranged a meeting with Richard Allen, the HOA president. He had been dismissive when they first met, but she wasn't going to let that slide. The wife knew how to use her position, and it was time to remind him who had the real power. The wife and her husband walked into the HOA office the following Monday morning. This time, there was no hesitation in her step. She was on a mission, and she wasn't going to back down. Richard Allen was sitting behind his desk when they entered. His face darkened the moment he saw them. I'm not sure what you think you're accomplishing by showing up here again, Richard said, his tone cold. We're just following through on the project. We've already made our decision. The wife didn't waste any time with pleasantries. She stepped forward, placing a thick stack of documents on the desk in front of him. I don't think you fully understand what you're up against, she said, her voice firm. I've looked into everything. I know about your plans, and I know exactly what you're trying to do. But you're not going to get away with it. Richard leaned back in his chair, clearly trying to remain in control. What's your point? My point, the wife continued, is that you think you've bought up all the land around the lake, but you've missed something important. Something that could ruin your entire development. Richard raised an eyebrow, clearly intrigued but unwilling to show it. And what exactly would that be? The wife smiled, a small but knowing smile. I control the dam. Without the dam, your development plans are nothing but an expensive pipe dream. For the first time, Richard's composure faltered. He shifted in his chair, clearly uncomfortable. What are you talking about? You can't just hold us hostage over a dam. You're being unreasonable. Am I? She replied, her voice cutting through the tension in the room. I own the water rights. I control the flow. Without it, the cabins you want to build will be underwater. You can't move forward without my consent. Richard was silent for a moment. The wife could see the wheels turning in his mind as he tried to assess the situation. Finally, he spoke, but his voice was tight. You can't stop progress. This is for the benefit of the community. The cabins will bring in revenue, jobs, and more amenities. The wife leaned forward, placing her hand on the table, her eyes locking with his. Don't talk to me about progress. You're not building a community. You're building a profit for yourself and your friends. You didn't even have the decency to consult the people who live here, who've worked hard to make this place their home. You've crossed the line. Richard's face reddened, but he held his ground. You can't just come in here and expect to control everything. The HOA is a legally binding entity. You don't have the power to make us do anything. The wife took a deep breath, staying calm despite the growing anger inside her. I don't need the power to make you do anything, she said, her voice steady. I've already made my move. I've got enough leverage to stop your entire project. If you want to keep pushing this, I'll make sure you regret it. But if you want to do the right thing, you'll call off this development and respect the land and the people who live here. Richard stared at her for a long moment, his face a mixture of frustration and calculation. He clearly didn't want to back down, but he knew he was cornered. Finally, he spoke, his voice tight with forced calm. You think you've won, but you haven't. The HOA has resources. We'll find another way to build this. You're just delaying the inevitable. The wife smiled, a knowing glint in her eye. We'll see about that, she said. But I suggest you make the right decision, because I'm not going anywhere. And neither is the dam. With that, the wife turned and walked out of the office, leaving Richard sitting behind his desk, fuming. The tension in the air was thick, but the wife knew she had planted the seed. It was time to play her cards carefully. The HOA had made their move, and now it was her turn to make sure they knew who was in control. The wife knew that the confrontation with Richard Allen wasn't the end of the battle. It had been a small but important victory, a reminder that they weren't helpless in the face of the HOA's overreach. But she also knew that the HOA wouldn't just walk away. They'd try to find a way around her, to push through the project they had their eyes set on. The fight was far from over. Over the next few days, the wife and her husband discussed their options, trying to figure out their next move. They knew they had to be strategic. This wasn't just a fight for the lakefront property. It was a battle to protect their home, their peace, and their rights. The wife spent hours digging through old records, property deeds, and community agreements. She wanted to know everything about the HOA's legal standing, about any loopholes they could exploit, and how they could turn the tide in their favor. One evening, as she sat at the kitchen table with a stack of papers in front of her, the husband sat across from her, watching her work. You're really determined to take them down, aren't you? He asked, his voice a mixture of admiration and concern. The wife looked up from her papers and met his gaze. "They're trying to take what's ours," she said firmly. "They've crossed a line. They think they can control us just because they have money and power. But they're about to learn that they don't." The husband nodded, sensing the quiet strength in her words. "What's the next step?" he asked. "We go to the community," she replied without hesitation. "We rally the people who are fed up with the HOA's control. We get them to understand that this isn't just about us. This is about everyone who lives here, about taking back the power from a group that thinks they can do whatever they want." Over the next few days, the wife and her husband met with other residents in the neighborhood. At first, the reaction was mixed. Some were fearful of the HOA's power. Others were uncertain about how much they could do to fight back. But the wife knew that if they could show the people the truth, that the HOA wasn't just making decisions for the good of the community, but for their own profit, they could gain the support they needed. "We're not just fighting for a ramp or a piece of land," the wife said at one of the community meetings, her voice steady and commanding. "We're fighting for our right to live freely, without fear of people who think they can take whatever they want. The HOA is in this for themselves, and it's time they were stopped." Slowly, the room began to shift. More residents spoke up, sharing their own frustrations with the HOA, about the restrictions, the fees, the way they were treated like outsiders in their own neighborhood. It was clear that the community was fed up, and the wife had just given them the spark they needed to rise up. "What can we do?" one of the residents asked. "We don't have the money to fight them in court." The wife smiled. "You don't need money," she said. "You just need to understand the power we already have. We have the right to organize, to push back against their decisions. And we have the truth on our side." Word spread quickly through the neighborhood. The wife's message was simple. If the HOA could be stopped here, they could set a precedent for all the other neighborhoods where residents were being silenced. This wasn't just about the lakefront. This was about changing the way the HOA operated, about holding them accountable for their greed and manipulation. As the community gathered behind her, the wife knew they were ready for the next step. But she also knew that the HOA wouldn't give up easily. They would try to fight back with everything they had. And when that time came, the wife would be ready. The tension in the air was thick, and the HOA would soon realize that they were no longer the ones in control. They might have thought they had everything figured out, but they hadn't accounted for the wife's hidden card, the one they had no way of countering, the dam. It wasn't just the threat of the water rising that they had to worry about. The wife had spent years learning the ins and outs of the system, how to control the flow, how to manipulate the water levels in ways that no one would have expected. She had always kept her power quiet, never needing to use it. But now, with the HOA pushing them to the brink, it was time to take action. She wasn't going to let them destroy her home, her peaceful lakefront, without making them pay for it. The next morning, the wife made a call to a local environmental engineer she trusted. She explained her plan to use the dam, not as a weapon, but as leverage to force the HOA to back down. She needed their help to understand the technicalities and the potential consequences of manipulating the dam's output. The engineer was cautious at first, but after hearing the full scope of the situation, he agreed to help. "If you do this right," he told her over the phone, "you could make the HOA rethink their plans. But be careful, this isn't something that can be undone quickly." The wife knew the risks, but she also knew that the HOA had left her with no choice. She had been patient long enough. It was time to show them what true power looked like. As she hung up the phone, the wife felt a surge of determination. The game had changed. The HOA had underestimated her, and now they were going to feel the full force of her resolve. With the support of the community and the power of the dam on her side, the wife was ready to take the next step in their fight. She knew the HOA wouldn't back down without a fight, but neither would she. The tables had turned, and the wife was now in control. The morning after the community meeting, the wife could feel the shift in the air. It wasn't just about her anymore. The entire neighborhood was rallying behind her. The HOA had made a mistake by underestimating their power. Now it was time for her to make her next move, one that would hit the HOA where it would hurt the most: their plans for development. Her mind raced as she thought through her options. She had already shown them that they couldn't just take what wasn't theirs. But now, she needed to make sure they knew she wasn't playing around. The dam was her trump card, and she knew that she couldn't keep it hidden for much longer. It was time to use it. As the wife sat at the kitchen table, she reviewed the research she had gathered over the past few days. She had learned everything she could about the dam systems, its regulations, and how she could influence the water levels. It wasn't just about flooding the land. It was about showing the HOA that they didn't control the situation. She did. The wife called her sister, who had been an ally in this fight since the beginning. "It's time," she said, her voice firm. "We're going to make our first move today." Her sister's voice came through clearly, no hesitation in it. "What do you need?" "I need to make sure we've got the legal backing for what we're about to do. I don't want the HOA to twist this into something we can't control. We need to be airtight in our actions. I'll make the calls. You just focus on the dam." The wife hung up, feeling the weight of the plan settling in. She walked outside to the lakefront, where she could feel the breeze on her face and the coolness of the water beneath her feet. The HOA had no idea what they were about to face. She knew that controlling the dam didn't mean flooding the area. It meant making strategic adjustments that would slow the project down enough to force their hand. She couldn't risk outright destruction. That would be too dangerous, too hard to undo. But she could make things difficult enough that the HOA would have to reconsider their plans. As she stepped into the car with her husband, she couldn't help but feel a sense of anticipation. This wasn't going to be an easy fight, but she was ready. When they arrived at the dam, the wife took a moment to appreciate the weight of the responsibility she held. This was her domain. The calm waters that flowed beneath the surface were more than just a feature of the landscape. They were a tool, a weapon, and a lifeline. She could alter the flow with just a few adjustments. Her husband stood by her side, watching her as she prepared. "Are you sure about this?" he asked, his voice low. "Once we start, there's no going back." She met his gaze and smiled. "I'm sure. It's time to take back control." With that, she moved toward the controls. The dam was old, but it was reliable. She knew it like the back of her hand, having grown up nearby. With careful movements, she began adjusting the flow, making small but significant changes to the water level. It wasn't enough to flood the area, but it was enough to make the construction site unworkable. The workers wouldn't be able to dig, build, or lay foundations if the water levels were shifting unpredictably. The wife watched as the water level slowly dropped. It wasn't an emergency, but it was certainly an inconvenience. The HOA had no idea what was coming. As she made the final adjustments, she knew the HOA would try to fix things on their own. But by then, it would be too late. They would be caught in a cycle of delays, stuck in a situation they couldn't control. The wife and her husband returned home, feeling a rush of exhilaration mixed with the weight of what they had just set in motion. It wasn't the end yet, but it was the first step in taking back their property. The next morning, news reports began circulating about the sudden shift in water levels near the lake. The HOA didn't waste time trying to play it down. They quickly sent workers to check the dam and attempt to resolve the issue. But it was clear they were unprepared. The wife could see the signs of panic in their response. They didn't know what was happening or why. And worst of all, they didn't know how to fix it. The wife and her husband watched from a distance as the HOA scrambled to react. It was working. Slowly, they were starting to see the cracks in the HOA's armor. Word began to spread among the neighbors, and soon, people were calling the wife, offering their support and thanking her for standing up to the HOA. The wife knew the battle was far from over, but she felt a sense of satisfaction. She had made her first strike, and it had been effective. The HOA had underestimated them, and now they were starting to feel the consequences of their greed. The wife couldn't help but smile as she thought about what would come next. The power was shifting. The fight was just beginning, and she was ready for whatever the HOA would throw her way. The first signs of the HOA's panic became apparent the very next day. Workers were sent to inspect the dam, trying to figure out what had caused the water levels to shift so suddenly. They weren't prepared for this. The wife watched from her front porch, a calm smile on her face as she observed the chaos unfolding. The workers seemed confused, calling back and forth to one another, unable to figure out the cause of the fluctuations in the water. They had no idea that the woman they had dismissed was the one controlling the flow. The HOA had underestimated her, and now they were scrambling to fix what they didn't understand. By the time afternoon rolled around, Richard Allen, the HOA president, was on his way over. He had been the one to dismiss her at their first meeting, and now, she knew he was coming to figure out how they could fix the mess she had made. The wife had been expecting his visit, and when the knock on the door finally came, she was ready. She opened the door to find Richard standing there, flanked by a few of his associates. He didn't waste time with pleasantries. "You've made a mistake," Richard said, his tone cold, trying to appear in control. "I don't know how you did it, but you've disrupted our plans. You're making a huge mistake by trying to stand in our way." The wife met his gaze, her voice calm but firm. "I don't think it's a mistake, Richard. I think it's you who made a mistake by not listening to me. This is my land, my property, and you've tried to take it without so much as a conversation. I won't let that happen." Richard's expression hardened, but he wasn't ready to back down. "You think you can just change the water flow and get away with it? This development is going forward. You can't stop progress with childish games." The wife stepped forward, her presence unwavering. "This isn't a game. You've taken my land for your own profit, and now you're facing the consequences of your actions. You can't build your cabins if the land keeps flooding, can you?" Richard was quiet for a moment, clearly flustered. "We'll fix this. It's a simple technical issue," he said, though his voice lacked confidence. "We'll work around it." The wife raised an eyebrow. "No, you won't. Not until you realize who you're really dealing with. You see, I control the dam. And as long as I'm here, you can't make those cabins. If you continue, I'll make sure you regret it." Richard's face twisted with frustration. "This is ridiculous," he spat. "You can't just throw your weight around like this. You have no right." The wife smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "I have every right. You've misused your power for too long. You've ignored people, taken their land, and now you're trying to push me out. But I'm not backing down. If you want those cabins, you'll have to go through me." Richard's eyes flickered with a mix of anger and disbelief. He clearly hadn't expected this kind of resistance. "You can't stop the construction forever," he said, his voice a little quieter now, but still filled with defiance. "We'll find a way. You're just delaying the inevitable." The wife crossed her arms. "Maybe. But if you keep pushing, I'll make sure you don't get far enough to build anything. The power is in my hands now, Richard. And if you think you can just bulldoze through this neighborhood, you're sorely mistaken." For a moment, there was a heavy silence. Richard was calculating, trying to think of an out. But the wife could see the uncertainty in his eyes. He knew he was dealing with someone who wasn't afraid to fight. Finally, he sighed, throwing his hands up in frustration. "This is a waste of time," he muttered. "I'll have my legal team look into this, but don't think you've won." He turned and started to walk away, his associates following behind him, but the wife's voice stopped him in his tracks. "Don't bother," she called after him. "You'll never win. I've already done the groundwork. I'm not the one who needs convincing. You are." Richard stiffened, but didn't turn around. He gave a curt nod, signaling the end of the conversation, and walked away, his footsteps echoing in the quiet neighborhood. As the wife stood on the porch, watching them leave, she felt a sense of quiet satisfaction. Richard had been arrogant, dismissive, and sure of his own power. But now, he knew better. The tables had turned, and the HOA had no idea what they were about to face. The wife turned back into the house, her resolve stronger than ever. She had made her move, and now she had the HOA right where she wanted them. But she also knew this was only the beginning. They would try to fight back, but she was ready for whatever came next. She had control of the dam, and with it, she held the key to everything. The power was in her hands, and it was time for the HOA to realize that they couldn't take anything from her without paying the price. The wife could feel the growing tension in the air as the days went by. The HOA had been quiet since their last meeting, but she knew it was only a matter of time before they struck back. They were powerful, used to getting their way, and they wouldn't take her defiance lightly. The wife had expected retaliation, but she was ready. Every move she made had been carefully planned. She had spent the past few days monitoring the water levels and ensuring that the dam remained in her control. Every adjustment she made was a warning to the HOA. But she knew that they wouldn't stop until they got what they wanted. The phone rang one afternoon, and when the wife answered, she immediately recognized Richard Allen's voice on the other end. "You think you've won, don't you?" he asked, his tone flat and full of frustration. "This isn't over." The wife leaned back in her chair, unfazed by his anger. "I never said I'd won, Richard. I'm just showing you that you're not in control anymore. I'm not backing down, and neither should you expect your plans to move forward." Richard's voice became sharper. "You've caused enough trouble. We've been forced to delay the project because of your little stunt, and now we're taking legal action. You've gone too far." The wife chuckled softly, shaking her head. "Legal action? You can't stop the fact that I own the dam, Richard. You can't threaten me with court orders or regulations. I've got all the cards now." There was a pause on the other end of the line. The wife knew Richard was trying to regain his composure. "You're not the only one with power," he finally said. "We have connections. We have resources. This isn't just a small land dispute. We'll find a way to get what we want, with or without your permission." The wife's voice dropped to a low, confident tone. "The difference between you and me, Richard, is that I don't need to make empty threats. I've already made my move. Now, it's your turn to decide how far you're willing to go." Richard didn't respond immediately. The wife could hear him taking a deep breath, trying to keep his frustration in check. After a few moments, he spoke again. "You'll regret this. We're not finished." "I'm sure you'll try again," the wife said. "But don't think for a second that I'm going to let you bulldoze my property, my home, for your cabins." She hung up the phone, her fingers tingling with the power she knew she held. The HOA had underestimated her, and now they were realizing that they couldn't just walk all over her. The next few days were tense. The HOA sent a few more contractors to the site, trying to make adjustments and plan their next steps, but the wife's careful adjustments to the dam's water levels continued to throw them off. Work on the cabins was stalled, and every time they tried to move forward, the water levels would shift unexpectedly. She wasn't flooding them out, but she was making it difficult enough that they couldn't continue their work. It wasn't just a strategy, it was a warning. The wife kept her ear to the ground, listening to the whispers around the neighborhood. The word was spreading that the HOA was in trouble, and people were starting to take notice. The neighbors, who had once been afraid to speak out, were now rallying behind her. The tension was building, not just between the wife and the HOA, but among the residents who had long been silent. They were beginning to realize they had power too. One evening, the wife sat on the porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon. Her husband joined her, sitting down beside her with a quiet smile. "What happens now?" he asked, looking out at the lake. The wife looked at him, her expression thoughtful. "Now we wait. We let them make their next move. And when they do, we'll be ready." The wife knew that the HOA wasn't done yet. They would try again, they would fight back harder, but she also knew they had already lost. The more they tried to push, the more they exposed themselves for who they really were. Greedy, manipulative, and unwilling to play fair. The wife had taken the first step in a battle that was far from over. But she was confident, she had the support of the community, the power of the dam, and the will to fight until the HOA had no choice but to back down. As the days passed, the tension continued to build. The HOA wasn't done trying to push their plans through, and the wife wasn't about to stop fighting. She knew that the power struggle wasn't just about land. It was about respect, control, and holding the powerful accountable. The community was watching, and the wife was determined to show them all that she wasn't just fighting for her own home, but for the future of everyone who had ever been overlooked or mistreated by the HOA. The stakes were high, and the next move would decide everything. The days following the wife's bold actions with the dam were filled with mounting tension. The HOA had been unable to move forward with their construction, and though they had tried to ignore her influence, it was clear that the power had shifted. The community, once silent, had begun to speak out more, and whispers of the wife's stand against the HOA spread like wildfire. It wasn't just about her lakefront anymore. It was about taking back control from an organization that had held too much power for too long. The wife knew the HOA wouldn't let this slide. They would fight back, but she didn't expect them to come at her so aggressively. Late one afternoon, as she was finishing up some work at the kitchen table, her phone rang. It was an unfamiliar number, but she picked it up, knowing that this might be the moment she'd been waiting for. "Hello, Ms. Daniels." The voice on the other end was cold, familiar, and unmistakable. It was Richard Allen. "What do you want, Richard?" The wife's voice was firm, showing no sign of fear. "We're done playing games," Richard said, his tone biting. "You've caused enough damage to this community. You've disrupted our plans, and we've had enough. We're moving forward with the cabins, with or without your approval." The wife's grip tightened on the phone, but she stayed calm. "You've had plenty of chances to do this the right way, Richard. Now you're the one who's out of control. You're too far gone to back out now, aren't you?" Richard scoffed, but she could hear the unease in his voice. "You think you're in control of this situation? You've just delayed us, but that's all you've done. We have the resources, the support, and the legal backing to proceed." The wife paused, her mind racing, weighing her next words carefully. "I control the dam, Richard. And as long as I do, you have no project. No cabins. No development. All you've built is a house of cards, and I'm about to make it crumble." There was silence on the other end of the line. Richard clearly hadn't expected her to come back so forcefully. He finally spoke, his voice quieter now, but still tinged with anger. "You'll regret this. You think you've got the upper hand, but this isn't over. You'll see." The wife hung up before he could say anything else, her pulse quickening. She knew that this wasn't just an idle threat. The HOA was now cornered and desperate, and they would do whatever it took to push their plans through. The question was, what would they do next? That night, as she and her husband discussed the phone call, the weight of the situation began to feel heavier. "What if they're right?" her husband asked. "What if they go around us? They have more resources. What if they just find another way to move forward?" The wife shook her head, her expression resolute. "They can try, but they don't understand the full scope of what I'm capable of. The dam is my leverage, and I'm not letting it go." The next morning, she went to the dam again, checking the water levels, making sure everything was in place. Her mind was working through the possibilities. What more she could do, how she could raise the stakes. But she knew one thing, she couldn't back down now. She had to stay ahead of them. That evening, the HOA's retaliation arrived. Richard Allen, clearly desperate, showed up at her front door with a team of lawyers and city officials. They were all in suits, carrying official-looking documents. It was clear they were trying to intimidate her into backing down. "Ms. Daniels," Richard began, "we've come to settle this once and for all. The community needs these cabins. You're holding us hostage with your control over the dam, and we're prepared to do whatever it takes to stop you." The wife stood her ground, meeting his gaze with unwavering confidence. "You're the ones who are holding this community hostage," she replied. "You've taken land without consent, you've ignored the needs of the people, and now you're trying to bully me into letting you take over." Richard's lawyers began to speak, presenting legal jargon, but the wife tuned them out. She had been preparing for this. She knew what they were trying to do. They were using legal threats to break her resolve, to pressure her into letting them continue their project. But it wasn't going to work. She had one final piece of leverage, and she was ready to use it. "I don't care about your threats," she said calmly. "You've already overplayed your hand. If you want to continue with this project, you'll have to go through me. I've already stopped you once. What makes you think I won't do it again?" The lawyers shifted uncomfortably. Richard looked from the wife to the team behind him, clearly caught between his desperation and the reality that his position was crumbling. "You'll regret this," Richard said, his voice low and filled with rage. "This isn't over." The wife watched as Richard and his team turned and walked back to their cars. The moment they left, she knew they were planning their next move. But she wasn't worried. She had done what she needed to do. The pressure was on them now, not her. She had forced them into a corner, and the next steps were on their shoulders. As the wife stood there, watching the HOA retreat, a deep sense of resolve filled her. She wasn't just fighting for her home anymore. She was fighting for everyone in the community who had ever been silenced by the HOA's greed. The moment was tense, but she knew she had the power. The fight wasn't over yet, but the tables had turned. And this time, the HOA would have to play by her rules. The days after the confrontation were tense, but the wife remained calm. She knew that the HOA would not back down easily. They had too much to lose. But now, they had no choice but to deal with the consequences of their actions. The wife's control over the dam was her biggest weapon, and the HOA had learned it the hard way. However, she also knew that Richard Allen and his team weren't going to stop trying to take her land. The fight wasn't over yet. The HOA was planning their next move, and the wife could feel it in the air. It wasn't just about stopping their construction. It was about taking back the community from an organization that had too much unchecked power for too long. One evening, as the sun began to set over the lake, the wife received another phone call. She knew it wasn't going to be good news. When she picked up, Richard's voice immediately cut through the silence. "You've made your point, Ms. Daniels. But we're not going to let you hold the entire community hostage any longer. We're going to court." The wife took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the moment settle in. "I figured this was coming. But let me make something clear, Richard. You're not going to win. Not in court, not anywhere. I control the dam. You can't build anything without it. So go ahead, take me to court. You'll be fighting a losing battle." Richard's voice hardened. "You're underestimating us. We have the legal team, the resources, and the support to push this forward. And you don't have the power to stop it all." The wife felt a small, cold smile curl on her lips. "You keep thinking that. But let me remind you, Richard, you can't control the water. I can. You won't get a single shovel in the ground if I don't allow it." There was silence on the other end of the line for a moment before Richard spoke again, his voice a little less confident. "We'll see about that. We'll make sure you regret this." With that, he hung up. The wife stared at her phone for a long moment, feeling a mix of anger and resolve. She wasn't going to let them bulldoze her home, her land, or her community. It was time to take the fight to the next level. The following morning, the wife and her husband gathered the community for a final meeting. They were ready to take this battle to the courthouse, and they needed everyone's support. Word had spread, and people from all corners of the neighborhood were coming together. They were tired of being silenced, tired of being pushed around by an organization that didn't care about their needs. The wife stood before them, her presence commanding the room. "We've come a long way, but the battle isn't over yet. The HOA thinks they can take everything from us, but we know the truth. We are stronger than they realize. This is our community, and we're not backing down." The crowd murmured in agreement, a sense of unity and strength filling the room. The wife could feel the power shift once again. The people were with her. They were no longer afraid. They were ready to fight for what was rightfully theirs. Later that afternoon, the wife stood at the edge of the lake, staring at the water. She could see the reflection of the setting sun dancing on the surface, and for the first time in days, she felt at peace. She knew what she had to do. The court battle would be tough, but she wasn't going into it unprepared. The HOA's greed had pushed them too far, and now they would have to face the consequences. The next day, the wife met with her legal team. They were prepared, having gathered all the evidence they needed to expose the HOA's wrongful actions. It wasn't just about the land grab. It was about the way they had tried to manipulate the system, bypassing the residents and forcing their plans through without proper approval. The wife and her legal team were ready to go to court. And as they walked into the courthouse, She felt a sense of calm determination settle over her. They weren't just fighting for a ramp, for cabins, or for her lakefront property. They were fighting for justice, for the right to have a say in the decisions that impacted their lives. The HOA had underestimated them, and now they would pay the price. The case went to trial, and the tension in the courtroom was thick. Richard Allen and his team tried every tactic they could to discredit the wife, to twist the facts in their favor, but the evidence was clear. The wife's control over the dam, her legal ownership of the property, and the HOA's failure to properly consult the community were all undeniable. The wife took the stand, her voice steady as she presented the case. "I didn't want this fight," she said, her words measured and calm. "But when the HOA decided to take what was mine without permission, when they decided to bulldoze our homes for their own profit, I had no choice but to stand up for what's right. This isn't just about me. It's about every person in this community who has been pushed around, ignored, and treated like they don't matter." The room was silent, and even the judge seemed to take notice of the wife's words. Richard and his team had no response. They had lost their edge. As the trial came to a close, the wife felt a sense of relief wash over her. She had fought for her home, for her community, and for her right to be heard. The HOA had tried to tear them apart, but they had stood strong. And in the end, it was the truth that won. The judge ruled in favor of the wife, ordering the HOA to cease their development plans immediately and return the land to the residents. The wife stood up, her heart pounding with triumph. The community had won. The battle was over. And as she walked out of the courthouse, the sun setting behind her, she knew that this victory was only the beginning. It wasn't just about saving her lakefront property. It was about proving that when people stand together, they can take down even the most powerful forces. The HOA was defeated, and the community was free. It had been a long, hard fight, but the wife had come out on top. The power had shifted, and the HOA would never again be able to manipulate or control the people who lived here.